This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold. Hi listeners, before we start, I want to talk to you about community. A podcast is a group effort. There's the hosts, the guests, and of course you, the audience. The more everyone works as a team, the better the show can and will be. Now we know all of you are busy people. So in order to make things as quick and easy as possible, we've put up a short survey on the show's website at obeythedna.com that you can fill out in just a few minutes. Doing so will help us to know how to make the show even better for you, our listeners, and grow this little podcast community of ours. So please drop by obeythedna, that's one word, obeythedna.com, and click on the listener survey button at the top. Let us know about your tastes and what kind of show you want this to be, so we can continue to make it even more awesome. Thanks for listening, and now on with the show.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions, gamers dominate the tabletop, and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello operatives and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Yep.
And today, we have a special Halloween treat for you. We're going to be talking about horror hosts, those denizens of the night who haunted the dreams of a generation for most of the 20th century. And to talk about horror hosts, we've recruited an expert on the subject, the maker of the documentary American Scary, and author of numerous books on horror hosts, Michael Monahan. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And just to be clear, on the American Scary front, I was the associate producer. Sandy Clark and John Hudgens were really like the driving forces behind making it. I'm just the guy who brought in all of the information. Right.
Okay. So you were kind of like the researcher then.
I was. Basically, the background story on that is that Sandy was out here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it was at a convention which featured our local host, Bob Wilkins, who had been on the air on KTVU's Creature Features back in the early 1970s. And Sandy saw that there was a line going out the door for Bob, and who had not been on the air for 30 years at that point. And so that attracted his attention. He went over and talked with Bob a bit, and then talked to someone who was working with him, and just wanted more information. This was a new topic for him, and so they pointed him to me. Sandy came over. I laid out basically the history of TV horror hosts to him, and he said, "Well, John Hudgens and I have been making a series of short films, and we were thinking about doing a feature documentary." When I initially thought maybe we could do another short film about Bob Wilkins, but man, seeing this here, I think we got a feature. And that's how I got into it. So I laid it out. They were interested in doing something, and that's how the whole ball started rolling for that.
Ah, okay. Interesting. Well, let's take things back a step, because we have listeners in Eastern Europe and South America and all over the world. And as far as I know, horror hosts are primarily only a North American phenomenon, aren't they?
Largely, really largely. There were a handful in England, a handful in Australia. There was a character in Australia called Deadly Ernest, who is actually a name that was franchised to different regions of the country.
Really?
And it was a different character entirely. They would create their own format in these different markets with a different actor, different style and background for Deadly Ernest. In England, there was more recently there was a host called Nina, who was initially was Nina Hagen, who was hosting horror movies. And then there were two Ninas that followed. The most recent was Rachel Grant. And she was on the air for a few years as Nina. At the same time that in Australia, there was a woman named Tabitha Clutterbug, who was had her own show, Graveyard Shift. And so those kind of run concurrently, and that was sort of the last wave of things coming out of England, Australia, although there was also a brief run for Dr. Terror in England, which included the cooperation of Kim Newman, who worked on some of that. And I can't remember a lot of the basic details about that offhand. But that said, yes, largely North American. One of the things I had said to Sandy early on is that, along with jazz, it's probably the only original art form to come out of America.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's just the way things kind of fell together.
Oh, that's okay. So, well, here, I was going to suggest, why don't you tell our audience what exactly a horror host is? Because, like I said, some of them might actually not know, and give us a little bit of background about where they came from and such.
Sure, absolutely. So, the TV horror host in America essentially existed in a period between 1957 and the late 1980s as locally produced television programs. Now, there were antecedents to the hosts of 1957, but what happened in 1957 was that Universal released their shock package of horror films to television. The original classic Frankensteins, Draculas, The Wolfman, The Mummy, for the very, very first time on television. And this was a big, big deal. And that so there were saturation bookings across the country. And in many areas of the country, local television stations would add a host to the proceedings for a number of reasons. One, local programming relied on local personalities, and each station defined themselves by their local personalities, their kids show host, their news team, and then in 57 also their horror host, but also dance party hosts, that type of thing, so that each station had basically had if not a lock, then they were at least defined by the personalities that they had at their station, and that was a big promotional thing for them. The other thing was a more practical reason, which was that these movies ran from anything from 60 minutes to 80 minutes long. And so you had a pretty wide range of time that had to be either filled or not. So a host was able to step in and do 10 minutes worth of shtick between the commercials or 5 minutes worth of shtick between the commercials and still fit within an hour and a half time frame.
Right. Wow, okay, that makes perfect sense.
So that was sort of the reason for horror hosts, and they were just embraced so enthusiastically at the time, and particularly among teenagers. And in a way, horror hosts connected with what later in the 60s became known as the counterculture, and you could tie them into rock and roll, for instance. So Elvis Presley and Zachary really kind of appealed to the same audience. That's what was going on there. Now, prior to 1957, TV had dabbled in horror hosts. The genre actually began on stage back in the 1920s with spiritual shows. There'd be magicians and spiritualist acts that had the sort of flavor that you would later see in a TV horror movie host.
Really?
And then those evolved into something even more recognizable to later generations, which was something they called the spook show, where there would be a magician would add sort of a mad scientist act to what he was doing. There would be monsters. There would be illusions that had the sort of the shocking effects of the Grand Guignol added to it, like guillotines and stabbings and monsters going into the audience and carrying people away, that type of thing, audience participation.
Right.
And then that further evolved in the 30s and 40s to the Midnight Spook Show, which would have the spook show that would end in what they called a blackout, where you would have glow-in-the-dark ghosts and skeletons flying through the audience. And then that would be followed by a movie.
Ah, okay.
And so that really became the template for what was later the TV horror movie host.
Now, had the first horror host that we know of, the first horror host was Vampira, wasn't it?
You know what? Vampira still likely holds that. But prior to it, there was in 1948 and into the early 50s, a program called Lights Out, which had moved to television from radio. And a lot of early TV was basically had dug into radio for its formatting, the variety shows, comic shows, even the dramas and mysteries. Mm-hmm. And Lights Out was presented by a fellow named Frank Gallagher as basically a floating head and a candle. He would introduce this half-hour drama. And in a sense, that also was another template for the horror host. And then author Don Glut pointed out in a book on shock theater in Chicago that in 1950 there was a host called the Swami, and I think what they were doing was it was another step in the direction. I wouldn't call him a full-fledged horror host, but they took the Lights Out model and had a host who would show, rather than a short drama, would serialize a movie over the course of a week. It would be a mystery film. So the Swami would introduce it. There'd be 15 minutes of, some film noir or mystery film. And then the next night, they would pick up from there, and over the course of a week, they would show an entire film. So in a way, that was radio on TV as well.
Right, yeah. I was going to ask you if those stage shows, the spook shows you mentioned, if we know whether they were in an actual direct influence on the early horror hosts, whether the early horror hosts had actually experienced those things.
Oh, you know what? They had to. They were so popular during the 30s and 40s, during World War II especially, the Midnight Spook Show was. And Bela Lugosi had his own spook show at one point. Glenn Strange and Lon Chaney appeared in, I believe, Dr. Silkini's spook show in the 1940s. And then later, and this is jumping ahead a bit, but Ron Swede, who became the Ghoul, in the early 1960s, went to a Dr. Silkini spook show in Cleveland with some buddies of his. And after the show, as Dr. Silkini was loading up his stuff into the truck, Ron and his friends had walked around behind the theater. They saw him loading up, and Ron stole a gorilla costume from Dr. Silkini's show, and they used that costume later to meet Ghoulardi at Euclid Park in the dead of summer. And Ghoulardi just thought that was such a ballsy thing for him to do that he invited him down to the station. Ron started hanging out at the station, became Ghoulardi's gopher, and then eventually, became the Ghoul in the 1970s. So spook shows affected horror hosts well into the 1960s.
Wow,
that's an amazing story. Huh.
Now, I was going to say, like you mentioned, that the horror hosts are part of the counterculture. And it's interesting because thinking of that, if you go back to say the early to mid 50s, you had the horror comics were popular, and they always had like a narrator.
Right,
that's true.
Right, and that also came from radio. And then things like Tales from the Crypt and The Crypt Keeper and the Old Witch, I think, was the third. And
The Witching Hour, wasn't it?
yeah, was it? There was The Haunt of Fear, Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror. Yeah, in any event.
And this is your area.
Yeah, yes. What they did add, and this, those books were produced by Bill Gaines, who also ran Mad Magazine. Now, Mad Magazine, again, big influence in that sort of counterculture, beatnik humor type of thing in the 50s. And what they brought to those comic book hosts was a sense of humor, which, again, carried over to the TV horror host. Now, Universal Pictures, and I'm sorry, I realize I'm jumping all around on this.
That's okay. That's par for the course with this show.
But Universal Pictures produced a series of films called The Inner Sanctum, based on the Inner Sanctum radio show. And of the either 5 or 7 films produced for The Inner Sanctum, all but the last one were introduced by a head floating in a crystal ball. So essentially, they were hosting their own movie. Wow. So all those pieces just kind of casually fall together into the horror host of 1957.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, and Vampira is generally regarded as the first horror host, and I stand by her as the first completely formed TV horror movie host in 1954. However, I haven't found documentation, but there was apparently a fellow who hosted as the Black Cat in Washington, D.C., and in one interview I saw with him, he quoted 1953 as the year that he was doing that program. And if that happens to be the case, then he would sort of take the mantle of first TV horror host. But until I see some sort of documentation, TV listings or whatever, I still have to stand by Vampira.
Yeah. Right, okay. Well, that makes sense. So how would the horror host idea then have spread from Vampira to the other parts of the country? Like, was Vampira syndicated? How did this idea spread?
No, well, Vampira was a local phenomenon. It was Los Angeles. LA. Right. She was another TV host. TV already had hosts for different types of movies. Right. And in fact, in Los Angeles, Vampira was so popular that they brought on a woman to host their romantic movies and called her Voluptua. And she didn't last. She's a trifle too saucy for the airwaves. But Vampira got national recognition through Life magazine. They came out and did some photographs of her, just basically as this, interesting character, an interesting piece of television. Up to that point, there were no, this was not a trend or a cultural event. This was just an interesting, eccentric host. The movies that she hosted were generally mysteries as well, although occasionally grade Z horror would be thrown in there as well, like The White Zombie with Bela Lugosi, that type of thing. But her films tended to lean more toward mystery. It was really the shock movie package that launched this as a national phenomenon, and that's one of the reasons I do think that spook shows had a big part in all of this, because spook shows traveled the country, and these hosts who were appearing across the country, they clearly lifted some ideas from the movies themselves, from their experiences in radio, and a lot of them worked in radio, and their own growing up, the comic books, etc. But there are some visual elements that if you look at photographs of a spook show and set it against a photograph of one of the hosts, there was a host in Wisconsin called Selwyn that I saw a photo of his set that especially drove that home. But even early Zachary at Roland, whatever, you set photographs of those stage settings side by side, and they're almost exactly the same. So right. I think a lot of people, especially since this television was predominantly being produced in the East at that time, so there was more of a theatrical tradition that went with it. So I just suspect a lot of these guys saw spook shows, and that is reflected also in the presentation, that sort of goofy, stagey, corny sort of thing that they were doing early on.
I think I'd have to definitely agree, because one of the interesting things that I just kind of hit on from all the stuff you've mentioned is that Vampira is the first horror host, but nobody picked up that shtick for a long time. It seems like all of the other ones were the mad scientists or the demented crypt keepers or the weird supernatural vampire master type guys in their lair.
Right. The most interesting thing about Vampira is that she was created whole. You know, and Mila Nurmi, who created Vampira, was an artist and really had a strong sense of design. And she, when she spoke with us, she talked about designing Vampira, and you know how important it was that it was black and white, because that, you know, black and white emphasizes form, and you know, so she really had. Wow. She really had design aspects in mind when she created that character. And then the personality, she was looking at television and just creating something that would be sort of almost like an Addams Family opposite of the sort of white bread stuff that was being presented on TV. So it was a satire in that sense.
Right.
And her show was huge, and as her contract was coming around for renewal, the station wanted her to give up a percentage of her ownership in the character so that they would control it rather than her. She refused, and they fired her. That's basically what went on. I'm sure as a personality, she may not have been the easiest person to get along with anyway, but business is what I think really just broke that bond. And yeah, as you say, there was a gap after that, before the Shock pictures came along. The only other thing, and it came out of L.A., there was a Dr. Diablo, and I believe that was 1956, who had a brief run on a station in Southern California as well. But beyond that, it really was pretty quiet until the Shock package, because that sort of coalesced everything. You know, it just, you've got Frankenstein, you've got Dracula, you've got the Mummy. Boom! It really was just, and I go back to rock and roll. It's just like it's just dropping rock and roll into the middle of everything, you know?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, because otherwise, you know, people, you know, stations didn't have a lot of reasons to pull together stray grade Z horror movies, because the only stuff that was out there prior to the Universals were things like, you know, from Monogram and Astor Pictures, and, you know, they were not heavy draws, let's say. And, you know, the Universals were just perfect for this whole thing, because not only were they great movies with great monsters, mind you, you know, it's just like, here are monsters, boom, there's your identifying subject right there. And they had the added appeal of being the films that grown-ups, that the parents grew up with.
Right, yeah.
And that kids were discovering for the very first time, because these things had not been in theaters for years, and they certainly hadn't been on television. So it was fun for the whole family.
Right, yeah.
Everybody had a stake in that.
That's kind of interesting too, because I was wondering, there doesn't seem to have ever been a big backlash of concerned citizen groups in that protesting horror hosts, and I find that kind of interesting because I think back as a little kid, I loved the Ghoul, and wow, did he do all kinds of horrible things on air. But you never seen, there didn't seem to be any kind of, I guess, organized resistance, and I'm wondering, is that something?
There absolutely was. Yeah,
there was.
At the time, there PTAs, churches, and citizen groups with conservative leanings were always vigilant toward things like, rock and roll or horror. These are the people who shut down Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror. So, but one of the main concerns with introducing these monster movies, these horror films to television, was, yes, they might create a reaction. So another aspect of the horror host, another reason they were there, was to help take the edge off some.
Oh, okay.
Right. And that may be why you had so few hosts who were serious. Hosts that were not, trying to add to the horror of it. You would have, the hosts were always friendly. They might have a diabolical sense of humor. They might be sarcastic even, but they tended to be pretty lighthearted overall, and that helped kind of cut the darkness a bit. And I think that actually helped them with a lot of these citizen groups, but it didn't stop them. Stations would constantly get complaints. And in some cases there were sort of it was almost minor, but kind of culturally interesting, that when the shock pictures were first out, many of them were showing up in the middle of the week. They'd be on Wednesday and Thursday nights.
I was going to ask about that. What time of day were these generally shown, or when were these shown? Yeah,
in general, they were shown late night on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and the idea being that really these are movies for adults. But what teachers would find is on Fridays, kids would be coming in and falling asleep in class because they'd been staying up. So stations, honestly, because of that, many stations moved the shows to Friday and Saturday night. Just because the kids were conking out.
Right. No, that makes sense. Because if I recall right from the film Turn Blue, I believe was the film about Ghoulardi.
Oh, yeah.
I remember he was on Friday nights, wasn't he? He was a Friday night sensation.
He was, and he was so big that they expanded him to Saturday. He had a Saturday show, but that was on during basically the family hour. I think it was 6 o'clock on Saturdays. And then, again, he was still so popular that they wound up giving him a Monday through Friday afternoon kids show called Laurel, Ghoulardi, and Hardy.
Yes.
He would show Laurel and Hardy shorts.
Right.
So there was a period of time where Ghoulardi was on the air in Cleveland 6 days a week, 7 times a week.
Right.
Yeah. And he was so popular on Friday nights, the police said that the crime rate dropped like 75%.
Yep.
Yeah.
I could believe that. Yeah.
He was huge. But they're going back to your earlier point about complaints. Toward the end of his run, they had created a soap opera parody of Peyton Place called Parma Place.
Right.
Parma's a district one of the neighborhoods in the Cleveland area.
Yes.
And the residents of Parma were up in arms about it, and they came down to the station with a petition and made them take that off the air.
Oh, wow!
So because they just thought it was so insulting to them, and the thing is, it was really huge. I mean, but people loved it. A lot of people in Parma loved it, but it was really just those sort of blue-nosed sniffers who were just, this doesn't reflect well, and this doesn't, And I think it was Big Chuck Shadowski, who was a friend of Ernie Anderson, who was Ghoulardi,
right?
Who told the story about how there was this at the Civic Hall. They had this big orchestra playing, for an evening of music, and there was a big audience there for it. And at one point, the conductor was introducing different musicians in the first chairs, and they got down to this young woman who was playing violin, who was so and so from Parma, and the entire audience yelled, "Parma!" And she was just mortified, and they sort of said, "Yeah, okay, I think that's about it."
Yep. Yeah. Oh wow, that's amazing.
So then once the Shock Theater was released, who became the horror host that everyone was copying then, or was there one?
That's a good point, because by and large, the people that we spoke with, who were especially the older broadcasters, would be quick to point out that they really didn't know what was going on in other markets all that much. I mean, you didn't have the sort of reach that you had even in the 70s or once cable and satellite came out, you could sample things from other areas of the country. But syndicated programming was generally restricted to your major network stuff, ABC, NBC, CBS. Everyone saw Green Acres, but not everybody saw Zachary.
Right.
But now that said, I think there were three basic templates for horror hosts, and there are definitely some others out there, but the three basics are Vampira, Zachary, and Ghoulardi. Those are the three horror host types that are out there. And Vampira especially was kind of a lock. Women who hosted horror films, and there were many fewer than there were men, tended to go with that model. There are variations within the model. Crematia Mortem, for instance, she wore a bustier and whatnot, but she wasn't sexy. She was kind of more Mama Hennish, and had a kind of a Betty Davis sort of accent that she used. But many, many more of them, like Macabre and Misty Brew and Elvira, I mean, really the most obvious, and there was a whole lawsuit behind that. But all of them followed that Vampira template. Now, the men had a lot more wiggle room, and Zachary was sort of a, what was he? He lived in the crypt, it seemed, but was he a vampire? Nah, maybe not really. He would talk about blood, and his wife slept in a coffin, and he'd drive a stake through her heart to calm her down once in a while.
Right.
But he was also kind of mad scientist, and he would play with beakers and have weird experiments with giant amoeba and using cauliflower for brains and, all this other kind of crazy stuff. So he kind of fit both of those molds, the vampire and the mad scientist. And then Ghoulardi was just the rebel. He was really the crazy Mad Magazine beatnik of TV. And that model, in Cleveland, clearly, you got a through line from Ghoulardi to the Ghoul to the Son of Ghoul. All of them followed that same string. But then across the country, you would still have other characters who were more, crazy and upbeat. Ned the Dead. There was a character in Flint, Michigan called Christopher Coffin, Reed Farrell, who, like Ernie Anderson, was also a voice actor. And strangely, and I was never able to nail him down on this. I talked to him one time, but Ernie Anderson would sign his Ghoulardi autographs without an H in Ghoul, so it'd be G-O-U. Boom. Christopher Coffin would sign his autographs C-R-I-S-T, so no H in Christopher. And I don't know if he did that as a tribute to Ernie or not, but he knew Ernie Anderson. So it's possible. And the Christopher Coffin character also had had dark glasses, a beard, and a goatee, like Ghoulardi, but he wasn't insane. He was a much more sort of sarcastic, cultured character.
Right.
But they swam in the same pool, so I wouldn't be surprised if he took some influence from him. Now the other character that directly took from Ghoulardi that I find really interesting is Jerry G. Bishop, who was Svengoolie in Chicago.
Okay.
Now Jerry G. Bishop was a DJ, a very popular DJ in Cleveland at the same time that Ernie Anderson was on the air as Ghoulardi. And they even, I think it was KYW, the station, counter-programmed against WJW, which was Ghoulardi's station. They counter-programmed Ghoulardi's Masterpiece Theater with Jerry G. Bishop in a dance program called Jerry D. What was it? Dancing with Jerry D. Whatever. So anyway, he had a dance show that was on opposite. Then he got a DJ job in Chicago, and he went to Chicago, and he took along a lot of the same sound cards that they're using at the radio and TV stations there, that were also used on the Ghoulardi show, then later on the Big Chuck and Little John show, et cetera, et cetera. So those familiar sounds would show up on his radio program. Then he was also the voice announcer at Channel 32 in Chicago. So at the top of the hour, you're watching Channel 32, blah 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 in Chicago. Stay tuned for such and such. That was his job for a while. So the station started a horror show. They started showing horror movies under the title Screaming Yellow Theater. And initially, they would just have title cards, and Jerry G. Bishop would do the announcing under the title cards, And he for the first week or so, he just did it pretty straight. Then after a while, he started adding a little Bela Lugosi accent to it, and then he started goofing on the movies more and more during those breaks, and they finally put an illustration of him on the title cards to go with all of that. And then they finally said, well, look, let's put you in front of the camera. So he created Svengoolie, and as he said, it was a variation on Ghoulardi. Svengoolie, Ghoulardi. He just kind of put a spin on that. But his character had the same sort of counterculture qualities that Ghoulardi had, but updated from beatnik to hippie. But he had the dark glasses, the beard and mustache, and the same sort of seat of the pants attitude as well. And so at some point, he also pulled in the most famous Ghoulardi joke. As I mentioned earlier, he would go to town on Parma. He would just mock them mercilessly on the air. And anytime someone mentioned the word Parma, he would say, Parma? And, that was the punchline for him. And, or they'd start playing polka music and say, hey, does this program go to Parma?
Right.
And so Jerry G. Bishop picked that up and using the local town, Berwyn. So anytime someone mentioned, that they were going to a specific place at a specific time, you'd hear a voiceover going, Berwyn, or when mail would come in and Berwin, and he had plucked that from Ghoulardi's Parma joke. Well, cut to 2016, Rich Coase, who was the son of Svengoolie in Chicago after Jerry G left and had worked with Jerry G on the original Svengoolie program, he's now Svengoolie on the MeTV network, national.
Oh, wow.
One of the last, there are maybe 4 horror hosts left in the country. Svengoolie, who's national, the Son of Ghoul in Cleveland, Zombo in Reno, and I understand there's a program called Bordello of Horror, and I've seen it, don't know too much about it, but that's really, that's kind of it. And Rich Coase still uses the Berwin gag. So here you have the longest running local joke in television history. Like over 50 years, people are still using the Parma and Berwin variations as a gag on network television. It's crazy.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's the simplest thing. But for some reason, it's a hook, and people just won't give that up. The other connection with Jerry G and Cleveland that's interesting is that Jerry G, being one of the top DJs, was the designated point person when the Beatles came to town. And eventually he traveled with the Beatles, and he was the radio guy who would put out, for all the stations. He was the guy on the ground who would hang with the Beatles and give reports on the tour as it was happening.
Right.
But during their stay in Cleveland, they'd have press conferences, and Jerry G. Bishop would run into Ron Sweet at these press conferences, because he was also a huge Beatles fan, and Ernie Anderson would help him get into these press conferences. So Jerry G. and Ron Sweet knew each other from these things. So when Jerry G. went to Chicago, he was Svengoolie for a couple of years, and then the station was bought by the Kaiser networks. And the Kaiser decided to syndicate the Ghoul to their various stations across the country. We got him out here in San Francisco in 1973. But they bumped Svengoolie off the air in Chicago and replaced him with the Ghoul, which did not go down well with the people in Chicago, who were hugely loyal to Svengoolie.
Right.
And plus, Ron came out, and his first thing, well, we finally got rid of that no-talent Svengoolie. Did not endear him to the audience at all. No. But but they knew each other back in Cleveland, and so it's just another strange little bit of coincidence that tied them all together.
Now, I've noticed, having seen various films and read a little bit about horror hosts, that Cleveland seems to be like the place for horror hosts for some reason.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like ground zero in some ways for horror hosts. Is there a special reason for that?
I think there are a couple. And one is that, especially during that period, Cleveland was kind of underrated as a media hub, but it really was. Outside of New York and Chicago, Cleveland was actually a really big media market. And additionally, Chuck Chudowski had pointed out that they were also a big test market. He said they had the Princess phone 3 years before it went national because they were testing it in Cleveland. So there's something about just the demographics of Cleveland that are appealing to media. And so I do think that that's part of it. Now, Cleveland's first horror host was actually another radio DJ named Mad Daddy. And he briefly hosted Shock Theater in Cleveland, but he was not popular on television. He was great great for radio, but just too abrasive for television. So then there was that gap, and then there was Ghoulardi, and everything that you see that followed really followed in the heels of Ghoulardi. He was that popular. He was so popular. He was he was a cultural event.
Yeah.
Ghoulardi, a real game changer, and all of the hosts that you see that kind of grew up out of that were in some way or another attached to Ghoulardi. Like Big Chuck and Houlihan followed immediately after Ghoulardi, and Chuck Shadowski had worked with Ernie Anderson on the Ghoulardi show. He was one of the directors of the Ghoulardi show, brought in a lot of the elements that were popular in the Ghoulardi show, including a lot of the music and a lot of the visual effects ideas, because he's a real experimenter. And putting Ghoulardi into movies, that came from Chuck Shadowski. So there were a lot of things that he was directly attached to. And then, of course, after Big Chuck and Houlihan, the Ghoul came along. And the Ghoul happened because Ernie was coming back to town to do a special with Chuck McCann and wanted his old Ghoulardi suit so he could do a Ghoulardi sketch. And Ron had saved all of that material after Ernie had left town. And so, you know, he used the opportunity to ask Ernie Anderson if he would come back to Chicago, or back to Cleveland rather, maybe once a month, and just like tape 4 shows. Just do 4 shows in a day, head back to L.A. where he was currently situated. And Ernie was just, first of all, too much work, no thanks. And secondly, already done it. And then Ron asked for permission. Hey, can I do this? Can I try it? And Ernie pointed out, well, Story Broadcasting owns the name Ghoulardi, so you have to change that. Maybe shorten it to the Ghoul or something. And that's how that kicked off. So then you had Ron Sweet the Ghoul. Now, there was, and again, as so often happens, there was a lawsuit here, but
of course,
son of Ghoul, Kevin Scarpino, Scarpino used to work loosely on the Ghoul show. He was also working with the Cool Ghoul at WOAC in Canton, Ohio. But he also hung out with Ron Sweet and that crew in Cleveland for a bit as well. There's some old shows where you see Kevin Scarpino in the background. He also won a Ghoul lookalike contest that Ron was running. And when he won the contest, Ron Sweet introduced him as the son of Ghoul. And there's taped evidence of this. This is on film, so we see that. Now, at that point, Scarpino had no interest, no idea that he was going to pick that up at all. It was just like, this was really, really fun. I really enjoyed this. Boom, done, gone. Ron Sweet goes off the air. Kevin Scarpino is working with the Cool Ghoul at WOAC for a while. And then the Cool Ghoul, George Cavender, he leaves the station. And the station is still interested in having a host for their thriller theater. So Kevin Scarpino decides to audition for that. And he figures, having grown up with Ghoulardi and the Ghoul himself, he's a huge, huge fan. He said, well, I figured you had to have certain things if you're going to be a horror host in Cleveland. So he got the beard and the mustache, and he actually did begin with some of the catchphrases that were familiar to both Ghoulardi and the Ghoul. He otherwise didn't look like either of them. He had a top hat, dark glasses, a cape, all kinds of different changes, cosmetic changes. But some of the early stuff could really arguably be said to look very much like Ghoulardi and the Ghoul. So Ron Sweet sued him. The judge did not agree that this constituted copyright infringement because basically, for a number of reasons, the most important being that Ron didn't own anything.
Mm.
He didn't have a copyright on Beard and Mustache. He didn't
Right,
have a copyright.
which he'd already taken from someone else.
Exactly. And he didn't have a copyright on Turn Blue. He didn't have copyright on anything. So, and the judge, in a larger sense, the judge was also saying, well, a horror host can be defined as, basically a colorful character who does comedy and hosts horror movies. So she gave the definition, a really broad sweep, and just didn't feel there was anything to that. And that led to a lifelong, really, battle between these two guys, Ron Sweet and Kevin Scarpino. But the ironic part of that is that while Ron has been on and off the air with big gaps, decades. He was off the air for like 12 years before he came back or something. Kevin Scarpino, once he started, was on the air every weekend, without a break, even switching stations for over 30 years. Now.
Wow.
So he just hit his 30-year mark. But yeah, WOAC closed down. They're closing down, and Kevin got a job at a news station in Cleveland and was able to transition, ending one show on a Saturday night and on the news station the following Friday. So he didn't miss a beat in all of those 30 years.
Now, obviously, so therefore, horror hosts in Cleveland have had a huge cultural impact. Is there any place else in the United States where horror hosts had an equal cultural impact on the local culture?
Yes, yeah, to varying degrees. Like Zachary had a huge impact in the New York area, especially when he was working there, and nationally as well. He had a hit with Dinner with Drac, and a smaller hit with a follow-up of the Monster Mash. But he was on Dick Clark's American Bandstand with Dinner with Drac, and so he got national exposure for that. And that was, that charted. That was a hit record nationally. So he definitely had an effect. I can speak personally here in the San Francisco Bay Area with Bob Wilkins, who is like huge on creature features here in the 70s. He was also doing a similar horror show in Sacramento from the mid-60s, and for a time he was doing both programs at once. So there'd be, Bob Wilkins had two double feature horror movies on the same night, one in Sacramento, one in San Francisco for many years. But he had just a huge impact locally for a number of reasons, most of which were just presentation and personality. It was such a fun show. But also some of it was timing as well, because Star Trek was being resurrected, first in syndicated television, and KTVU, his station, was running Star Trek. So he was doing a lot of promotional stuff for that, and it was just at that time that the Star Trek conventions were being launched. And so Bob Wilkins was heavily involved with those and with local promotions of the various Star Trek conventions. And then when the movies started being produced again, the cast of Star Trek were regulars on the Creature Feature show. They would come in to do interviews and things like that. And Bob Wilkins was like the master of ceremonies at a number of the seminal Star Trek conventions here in the Bay Area. So he had a big cultural impact there. Then you have Star Wars, which was produced locally. So there are episodes of Creature Features where folks would come over from Lucasfilm and drop in and do interviews. So Gary Kurtz and his wife were interviewed on Creature Features, and they had just come from the Academy Awards a few weeks earlier, and and they were promoting some other show, but they brought down props and costumes and things like that for the program, and there was that.
Mm-hmm.
So then Bob went down to a screening of Raiders of the Lost Ark in Los Angeles with some folks, and he saw George Lucas, and so he walked over to him and goes, "Oh, Mr. Lucas, my name's Bob Wilkins. I host a program in San Francisco, and I really enjoyed Star Wars. I just wanted to say hi." And Lucas said, "I know you. I used to watch you."
Right.
And so Lucas grew up watching creature features, and eventually offered Bob the job of president of Lucasfilm.
Really?
When they were building to the facilities, because basically he said, "I'm not interested in dealing with the press and things like that, and you do that really well. I would, I'd like you to do this job." And Wilkins actually did seriously consider it, but it would have meant moving to Los Angeles for a couple of years while they built the facilities in the San Francisco area over here in Marin. And he just didn't want to do that to his family, so he turned it down. But that was actually seriously discussed. So, because of all of those things, he has a much higher cultural profile than your average horror host might have.
Yes, definitely. So in a lot of ways, in that pre-internet era, the horror hosts, as you've already said, became the focus of local counterculture. They became the hubs for local horror, sci-fi, whatever counterculture.
Oh, absolutely. They were a hub. And again, and this is across the country. Seriously, this is across the country, because you'll find people showing up and promoting local events on a number of these different shows. But San Francisco was a huge media center. Now, back in the day, they would send the cast around to various television stations for interviews. After, I think it's probably in the early 80s or something, they turned that around and they just brought all the reporters down to L.A. on press junkets and just did that all at once. Prior to that, stars and directors would travel from station to station, the other way around. San Francisco was a huge, huge market. So all of these people came through town. Christopher Lee showed up on both Bob Wilkins and John Stanley's show. Wilkins interviewed, the directors, the actors, and John Stanley, even more than Wilkins, really kind of turned the program into kind of an entertainment magazine, in a sense, where he really emphasized bringing in costumed people who are doing events and promoting, a lot of local screenings, and he would do special programs on, he did a whole program on the Wrath of Khan, and he would do special trailer programs and things like that. Now, Wilkins did that as well. And Wilkins also promoted local filmmakers. That was another thing. Amateur films would show up on the Creature Features program. Some of these guys went on to did work in the industry later, like on The Simpsons and things like that. And some of them went to work for Industrial Light and Magic. Now, one of the big amateur filmmakers who showed up on his show was Ernie Vesalius, premiering Hardware Wars.
Yes, I was going to mention that. Yeah, I guess Hardware Wars came from that.
It did, but it came first from Bob Wilkins. Ernie Vesalius had screened it locally, but getting on Creature Features really launched that as a cultural touchstone. And that, and geez, they're still re-releasing that thing. I think they just recently came out with a Blu-ray or something like this. But it was really the Creature Features that kicked off the larger cultural interest in that little movie.
Wow, that's incredible. Even up here in Canada, we still actually were aware of Hardware Wars. We heard about it. I remember seeing it as a teenager.
Yeah.
I think on regular TV. And I guess I should bring this around, actually, sorry to go, because horror hosts, as we've said, are a North American phenomenon. But as far as I know, there aren't any Canadian horror hosts, are there?
I think the closest that you've got was Billy Van doing the hilarious House of Frightenstein.
Right. But that wasn't a true. They weren't hosting movies, though. It was almost a parody of horror hosts.
Yeah, well, it was an educational program. It was like Gothic version of Sesame Street, in a way. But that said, and that's why I say that was sort of the closest to it, because it had all of those elements otherwise. Right. And there for a period of time in Los Angeles, they used footage of the hilarious House of Frightenstein as wraps for movies.
Huh.
So he was repurposed as a horror host in L.A. for a while.
That would make sense, especially with Vincent Price on the show and all the other.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have heard rumors, or at least reference online, that there might have been a horror host in Montreal, but I don't know who it was supposed to be. I've just seen a reference somewhere to there being a horror host in Montreal. I don't know if that's correct or not.
Yeah, it's possible. Especially, do you know the period? Was it like in the 70s?
I think it was in the 60s or 70s. Yeah.
Yeah, because around in the late 60s through the 70s, they started something called superstations, like TBS and things like that, which were somewhere between local and national. They're kind of cable stations. And I know Bob Wilkins was syndicated to a couple of other markets up north on superstations. So it's possible either that someone was like Wilkins was being shown in Montreal, or a Montreal station saw the potential in something like this.
Right.
Oh, and even as I say that, there was Spacebar. You guys had Spacebar on.
Yes, Spacebar. Yep.
Yeah. So that's kind of close to horror hosts, at least in the same way as Mystery Science Theater 3000.
That's true. Yeah.
Format-wise, but that would come under the heading of horror host for sure.
Yeah. So you're right. We did have Spacebar, although again that was only within the last 15 years, I think.
Yeah.
Prior to that, we did have, because I'm in southwestern Ontario, as is Don. We did have Elvira in syndication. I remember that when I was a teenager.
Right.
We used to. My friends and I used to actually have sleepovers, and we would stay up just to watch Elvira.
Right.
We were teenage boys, of course, so there was certain puerile interest.
It explains a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, staying up to watch Elvira.
There's a movie.
There's a movie. Yeah.
You know what? I have to say, I never found her act really appealing.
I have to say, I agree with you, actually.
Yeah, and with one exception, I loved her first movie, and I was really surprised because I found her video presentation, her programming, a little obnoxious, and I think it never coalesced as a complete character to me, because she would switch from seductive to Valley Girl goofy with, in my mind at least, with nothing really transitional. So it really, every event seemed like an excuse for something rather than a whole character. But the movie, the first Elvira movie at least, The Mistress of the Dark, really had me laughing, and I really found her likable in that. And it may be because it seemed to, in a sense, borrow a bit from Pee-wee's Big Adventure. It had that sort of flavor, where she was able to be a focal character, going through a narrative. That to me was much more effective than the TV presentation. And
I can see that. I
did talk to a number of folks, like Stella in Philadelphia, Nancy Scioli, and Frank and Drac, who are also out of the Cleveland area, and they both happily pointed out that while Elvira was being syndicated in their areas, they beat her in the ratings. And
I could believe that.
I think there is this real local loyalty thing, and I'm positive she did much, much better in areas that didn't have a pre-existing host. And by the 80s, there were huge gaps,
Yes.
and things were really starting to fall apart at that point. So you went from having hundreds of hosts. Yeah, you had hundreds of hosts in the 50s and 60s, and it was down to dozens by the 80s.
Yeah. Right. I can see that. I was going to say, for we Canadians, horror hosts are, as I've said, an American phenomenon. We view them not as a local phenomenon. So for us, it's very different.
Well,
for most of us anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is an interesting perspective, isn't it? I'm not sure. The only experience that I have that's like that is watching hosts from England, for instance, like Dr. Terror or Nina, and just seeing it as a representation, rather than something that I've got roots with, because I found when I first started studying this, when I really developed an interest in it, the first outside host that I saw outside of my area was Sammy Terry from Indianapolis, and when I watched that show, I'd never been to Indianapolis in my life, but I got the vibe, because all of those local elements were so familiar to me from growing up that resonated with me, even though at the same time I could feel that local vibe. It was really different. And he'd be talking about how the weather was in November, in Indianapolis, which was different from my experience. But all of the technical elements of it were exactly what I grew up with on local TV. So I could relate to that. But it's really interesting to me to hear from people from outside that bubble, like you're saying, looking at it more as programming than as a cultural event.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why there isn't a great level of horror hosts here in Canada, because it wasn't part of our culture growing up. I find it fascinating, but mostly as an outsider. Now, Dawn, though, has a slightly different perspective, because Dawn grew up in Windsor, which is right next to Detroit.
Yeah.
So in that environment, that was local programming, right, Dawn?
Yeah, because we had, I'm thinking by the late 70s, early 80s, we had to be at least a dozen different horror hosts that we watched. Part of that might have been, I've mentioned in other shows, Mad Science runs in my family, and we had built an amp and a booster for our antenna, so we could pull stuff in. We'd get like Cleveland stuff in that too, but yeah, at one point it had to be at least a dozen different horror hosts to pick from around here.
Yeah, like you had Sir Ghastly Graves.
Yeah, Sir Graves Ghastly. Yeah.
Yeah, out of Detroit, and the Ghoul. And I remember when talking with Stella, who was out of Philadelphia, there was a period where their broadcasting signal was strong enough that people were picking it up.
Yeah.
Across the plains on a good night. So I'm not surprised that you had a bit of a reach with that stuff. Do you remember who else you were seeing?
Yeah, we had Sir Graves is a big one. The Ghoul. We had Stella, Big Chuck, and Little John for a while. We did get Elvira for a bit. We had we had a I definitely remember, like, after watching American Scary, I remember seeing what was it Melvin? The guy
Melvin out of Chicago. Now, really, now that was the early 1950s. Marvin?
The guy trying to kill his wife all the time.
Yeah, so that was the late 1950s, like 58, 59. You were seeing that?
Yeah, somebody.
You're not that old, Don.
I know, somebody must have been like, we got a lot of stuff where they'd rerun old shows and that, but.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like I remember that. We had a Count Scary.
Oh, yeah.
Right, of course, yeah.
Because he was. I remember him because him and the Ghoul had a feud going for a bit.
Right, they co-hosted Night of the Living Dead once.
Yeah. Well, that went on for a while. That they would do on each other's shows, and they would do back and forth insulting each other, and that went on for like a decade.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, because the Night of the Living Dead thing, that was a huge event in this area.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
So, out of curiosity, then, Michael, what was your entry to all this? Like, how you obviously grew up watching horror hosts. What made you take the next step of becoming almost an expert on the subject?
Well, what happened was this. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the first horror host that I saw was a fellow named Asmodeus, who was Frank Sheridan, who was on Chemo TV 20, and that was the place that I first started seeing the Universal monster movies when I was a kid. Things like Dracula's Daughter, Werewolf of London, Invisible Ray. You know, a lot of things that I had been reading about in Famous Monsters but had never seen. And so that just really grabbed me in a big way. And then Bob Wilkins came along, and he was showing things like Horror Party Beach and Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter, and things like that. And then I started seeing these really surreal, B movies, and that combination just really energized me in a way. I loved the classic Universal monsters, but at the same time, something like Horror Party Beach or Agent for Harm or these just weird damn movies that Wilkins was showing just became equally fascinating. And so that it actually expanded my taste in a big way. And then, as I say, we got the Ghoul. We also had Son of Svengoolie syndicated out here for a bit. And those were sort of the last hosts that I was watching. I didn't really watch John Stanley's Creature Features much. By that point, I had girls. And, that sort of distracted me for, what year is it now? And, and things just generally died off until Commander USA came on the USA Network and things like that. But it was in 1999 that there was a fellow named Scott Moon put out a magazine called Planet X. And I just happened to stumble across this, completely unbidden. And it had an interview with Bob Wilkins. And so I'm reading this interview. I'm going, oh, God, Bob Wilkins. Just had complete, nostalgia rush. And within the interview, he talked about the fact that he had a bunch of old Creature Features tapes that he was starting to sell. So I got a set of those tapes, and it's like 10 hours worth of Creature Features stuff. And I was I was drunk on nostalgia. I was just slobbering with the stuff. And that was in 1999. And beyond Wilkins, it just reminded me how much I missed local TV, period. I grew up with things like Sir Sedley and Captain Satellite and, even our local romper room and things like this. It's like I missed all of that stuff. And I was trading tapes with other people at the time, different movies and programs and stuff, and started asking them if they found anything that had a horror host on it. I'd be interested in seeing it. And as I say, the first I saw was the Sammy Terry, and I just absolutely loved that. And then the Ghoul came back on the air in Cleveland, and I thought, well, I've got my Bob Wilkins. I got to see some more Ghoul. And I tracked down somebody who was able to send me a copy of a Ghoul tape. And in the course of the show, he mentioned this character Ghoulardi. And I had no idea at that point what that meant. But I thought, got to find this Ghoulardi, man. How can you avoid a name like that? And so then I found someone else who had a tribute to Ghoulardi that the Big Chuck and Little John show did. So I sit down with that tape, and it's suddenly like, holy crap, Big Chuck and Little John, I love these guys. Ghoulardi, I love this guy. What the hell? And Big Chuck and Little John were still on the air in Cleveland, and really Cleveland is what sparked it, because they were still producing local TV in the way that I had grown up with it. There was the Ghoul, there was Big Chuck and there was Son of Ghoul. That was all going on at the same time, at least, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And that was just wonderful to me. And eventually I traveled out to Cleveland. I had won a skeleton on the Son of Ghoul show. He had a life-size skeleton. And a friend of mine was sending me tapes every week or every other week. I'd get a box of tapes with the Ghoul, Big Chuck, and Son of Ghoul. And so I was able to enter this contest because I had recent shows. And so he said, they were going to have a drawing with a postcard drawing for this life-size skeleton. And he said, and if you win, you can come on the show to claim it. I said, well, guess what we're going to do? So I sent in something over 100 postcards. I can't remember.
Wow.
And he said later he told me they got like 114 entries.
Oh, my God.
And 100 of those were mine.
Yeah, you kind of stacked the deck on that one.
So I turned to my wife and said, we're going to Cleveland. And as it happened, there was a convention going on out there. I had some friends, and so we turned it into a vacation to Cleveland. Got to go to the Big Chuck and Little John show, and after the show, we got to hang out with Chuck a bit. And I'm asking him questions about various things that had happened with him and Hooley. And he looked up at me because I'd been introduced as Mike from California. He goes, "Did you grow up in Cleveland?" I said, No, I'm just a real big fan, and I've been reading about this stuff. And then so I got to hang with him. I got to hang with Son of Ghoul, and all of that. At the same time, I was still getting tapes from other people, and now I was shifting that specifically to collecting horror host tapes. And so Dr. Paul Bearer from Florida, Fritz the Night Owl from Cincinnati, the Cool Ghoul from Cincinnati, Cremation Mortem, and some Elvira's and Commander USA's, and all these things just started. It generated a critical mass is what happened. Because every time I saw one of those shows, I wanted to find out more about who was behind it. And, what was that music? And, who directed this? And who's that person hosting this? And, here are these artists and people sending letters in and all that stuff. Again, it all went back to my youth, but it was somebody else's nostalgia. But just seeing these broadcasters and and knowing what a TV studio looked like and knowing what production looked like and seeing how each of these spoke to its local community. They would talk about a local business or a local parade that was coming up. And so I was finding out about city histories at the same time that I was finding out about host histories. And I just love that. Because it's not dead-end research. There's always somewhere else to reach within that because it's not just a guy or gal in a suit and a wig. There's a community, there's a history behind all of that, and it's cultural, and so this is a pop cultural research and genuine cultural research as well. So all of that just continues to feed my enthusiasm for it.
Wow, that's incredible, and I can completely understand as someone who has been fascinated by the horror host phenomenon for a little while myself. I find much the same thing, where it is about the local culture, and it's amazing to see how much they do reflect the local culture, which, as I said, they're a hub for that local culture.
Right. Yeah, and they meant a lot. And in one way, nostalgia is cheap because you can always reach for it, and it tugs the heartstrings somewhere.
Of course.
But I remember when, like, Captain Satellite would have some guy who was a Duncan yo-yo expert who would be on the show and demonstrate Duncan yo-yo, and then the guy would announce that he was going to be down at Ralph's Kingdom of Toys that Saturday. And if you went down to Ralph's Kingdom of Toys that Saturday and saw the Duncan Yo-Yo guy, you saw some guy who was just on TV.
Yeah.
You know, and that really meant something. I saw Bob Wilkins live when I was a kid. I actually got to help out on a show that he was doing in Stanford, and I got to meet Bob Wilkins. It was it was an amazing thrill. And then later in his life, I got to do some conventions with him again, and it was a different experience. It was a much mellower experience, but there was, at the time, there was a romance to television, specifically because it was so limited in a way. You had four stations if you were lucky, and then UHF came along, and oh my God, I can watch 8 different channels, and that was, so you got some variety, but not too much. I do, and it's not just because I'm an old codger, but I do find modern media a bit overwhelming. And I think there is really something to be said about culturally, philosophically, emotionally, a difference between watching a show and consuming content. To me, that's the big dividing line. When that changed from watching a show, and as soon as you say that, you can think of you're alone, you're with a group, you're with your family. Consuming content seems like such an individualized thing. And so that sort of there's a sense of isolation to it that I don't find appealing, even if there's individual programming that is being created that I like. I still know that there's a real difference. And emotionally, what resonates much more for me were programs that were produced for the local community, where people were literally talking to their neighbors.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I kind of agree, but I come at it from a different way.
Oh, of course.
Because I think, especially with like the horror hosts and that, one of the things that I always liked, and I still do, is you never knew what you're going to get. You never knew what the movie was going to be, what skits they'd be, the ones that had guests. You never knew who they're going to be. And I find nowadays when you look at like the bigger media, the problem is they spend so much money to produce anything, nobody wants to take a risk. So you don't really get those weird twists and surprises. And,
and speaking very, very specifically to that, commercial time used to be, it would be like $50 for a commercial spot. And now it's hundreds of thousands of dollars it can be, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
You could screw up a local commercial at some time, and in a way that was so funny that the advertiser would laugh along with it, and everything was cool. These days, you screw up a $30,000 commercial or something, nobody's laughing. So it's not relaxed. That was part of it. You could there was so much of it was seat of the pants and so relaxed.
Yeah.
And you really could get away with crap. I think one of my favorite stories, and I told this at a convention out here in San Francisco, and it went down huge. But Chuck Shadowski told this great story, and this to me goes right to the heart of especially live television. But Ernie Anderson, Ghoulardi, was at war with his station manager, Ted Bays. They just did not get along at all. And Ted Bays was really sort of an uptight personality, and Ernie Anderson was a real just screw you guy. And so they're constantly at each other's throats. So Ernie Anderson used to do a lot of sports events with his Ghoulardi All-Stars. And they would take cameras down, and they would film the games and film the crowds. And then they would show that footage on the Ghoulardi show. And, people would tune in, and they'd see themselves in the stands waving, and, and there'd be Ghoulardi, talking over the events of the game and goofing on all that stuff. And it was big fun, and people got to see themselves. So Ted Bays, for no other reason than to piss off Ernie Anderson, said, from now on, no more overtime for the cameraman, no cameras at your games. And so Ernie Anderson went on the show that night, and he said, well, I know a lot of you came out to the game yesterday, and you're tuning in tonight to see the footage. Well, our production manager, Ted Bays, doesn't think much of you. And he doesn't think much of your families or your friends who are tuning in to watch as well. So, if you have any complaints, and he reaches down, pulls up a card, here's his home phone number. And he said Bays had to change his number because it was blocked for days. He could not get a call in or out.
That's brilliant.
And, that's the power of local TV, and a local personality as well.
Wow, that's great.
Oh, I love that story.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
So, but in some ways, hasn't like YouTube almost replaced that local TV, even though it's national, even though it's or international? People are now doing that kind of local shtick, but they're doing it on YouTube for a world audience.
Yeah, but isn't that a weird thing? In a way, to me, it's the experience that you described, looking at American TV horror hosts from across the border, and seeing something, having a different experience of it because of that.
Right.
It's a different bubble, and I view YouTube in a much different way than I do television. Especially the way television used to be, what television was, and part of that is because it's almost conversely. But it's like, because the choices are seemingly infinite, you make very, very few choices.
Right.
You target a couple of things that you keep returning to.
Right.
Either directly or thematically. And so you're really limiting a lot of everything else. One of the experiences of local TV that I had was, say there was a program on or a movie on that I really, really wanted to see. Oh my gosh, they're showing Son of Kong. And I really want to see that. It's on at 3 p.m. on Channel 7. Well, 2 p.m. on Channel 7, they're showing Wide World of Sports.
Right.
I don't give a crap about sports. I never did. So here I am. I'm stuck. It's coming up to 3 o'clock. I'm a kid, and I am bored. So I turn on the TV, and I turn it to Channel 7 because I don't want to miss the beginning of King Kong or Son of Kong. And there's Wide World of Sports, and I'm just yawning. And then they cut to winter sports, and it's a slalom. And it's like, wow, that's cool. And then the following week, if they're still doing winter sports, I'm waiting for the slalom because I want to see that. That's really cool. That's really interesting. So you make discoveries. Being kind of forced into a limited pattern, you actually, I find that you discover more. Now, completely by accident, you might find something that you weren't interested in that you're now interested in. And the same sort of thing goes even with like cable and satellite stuff. When I was a kid, I grew up, I would watch Warner Brother cartoons, Popeye cartoons, all this stuff was on TV. Now it's all on the Cartoon Channel.
Yeah.
You go to one place for cartoons. When it was on during the afternoon with my kid shows, it would be on in between. There would be cartoons I don't care about, or cartoons, oh my God, that's a really, really early Daffy Duck, because that is not the Daffy Duck that I'm used to. And then suddenly I'm learning about cartoon history, because I'm not choosing every single thing that I'm seeing. I'm forced to see things that I don't necessarily have an immediate interest in, but suddenly the things that I'm interested in gain a perspective that they otherwise would not have had. So, and I know it sounds, again, I don't want to sound like an old crank, because because the internet absolutely allowed me to track down a lot of things that I otherwise would not have found, or certainly wouldn't have found as quickly as I would have just, writing a note and slapping a stamp on it. Although that's how I originally got in contact with people in Cleveland, and but at the same time, the internet, allowed me to find old Mystery Science Theater shows that were done on KTMA when it was a local station. I read about them in an article, and within a week, I had a box on my porch that had like 3 shows. Boom! That's the internet, and that's the definite benefit. That's where it's a great tool. And the same with YouTube. There's a film critic in England that I love, and so and he posts the blog, so I'm there almost daily. I'm checking out something that this person is doing. So there's no way I would do away with any of that stuff at all. It's just as a personal preference, I like stumbling into things and discovering things, and I just don't always get a sense that it's easy to get into a rut if you just look and find and accept the things exactly as you want them, So, so my feelings are really sort of mixed on that sort of thing. And then additionally, I've got a huge DVD library, huge DVD Blu-ray library,
I bet.
and I kiss them goodnight every night. I love the damn things. But at the same time, I also have memories when I was a kid of opening the TV guide and looking for monster movies and circling those movies, making my schedule for the week. And in some cases, there would be something that was on at 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning when I was a kid, and I'd have to find some sneaky way of making that happen. And suddenly it's a different experience. Now I've got a story. I have the same movie on my shelf. The mood hits me to see it. 3 seconds later, it's it's on my screen, and I'm watching it. And man, that is just the most wonderful thing. I would never give that up. But at the same time, there's not a story behind it. It's just me watching a movie now.
Yeah. Right. Whereas having to stay up till 3 a.m. to watch Reptilicus on a late night channel, there's something about that, at least when you're a kid anyway, that it adds some spice to your life. It's an experience, and it's an event.
Yeah.
I literally was doing jumping jacks and walking in circles so I could stay up and see Frankenstein Meets the Space Monster that was on 1:30 on Channel 5. I stumbled across it in the guide just before I went to bed, and I said, well, somebody's staying up. And
Right.
And so that movie looms large in my memory because of it. I mean, I love that film. And it is the biggest piece of crap. And but it's my biggest piece of crap, and I will hug that piece of crap until I get it all over me, because I've got just a relationship with that film now.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the wonderful things about broadcast television.
Yeah.
So, Michael, you have authored several books on the subject. Can you tell our audience about them?
Sure, absolutely. I wrote 2 books so far on the history of TV horror hosts. The first was American Scary, which is a companion piece to the film. And essentially, within the first week that we were in production, I had said to Sandy, this is driving me nuts, because we're doing 1 hour, 90-minute interviews with these people, and only 3 or 4 minutes of any of these interviews is going to show up in this film. But my God, the information that we've got, there's got to be a way of presenting it. And we discussed a few ideas, and one of them was to just let me have the interviews at the end of the day once production was done and put it out in book form, and which is what I did, and which also allowed me to refocus the topic the way that I wanted to. Sandy and John were equally interested in people who were producing programming on public access and the internet, seeing it as an extension of what had been happening with local TV. My feeling was that those things that were being produced for new media were essentially cosplay. There were people dressing up in costumes because broadcasting was the key element to me. All of the stuff we were talking about had its roots in television broadcasting. And whatever the new media is, it's not locally produced broadcast TV. And so that's where my focus is. And I was able to do that with the book by setting the interviews up chronologically so people could see over the course of the interviews the changes in the media and the media landscape that led to the end of the local broadcasting era, the end of horror hosts, and again, why that is such a precious, precious thing in our cultural history. And then immediately after that, I wrote a book called Shock It To Me, which was the history of the local San Francisco horror host market. And that was, Shock It To Me comes from the program hosted by Asmodeus that I mentioned earlier, which was Shock It To Me Theater. And so I was able to discuss the first horror host that we had on the air, was named Terrence, who created a riot on the campus of UC Berkeley by saying that he would show up there. And there was a headline the following day. He had shown Dracula that night, and the headline said, 1,000 UC students in Dracula fracas.
Right.
Which, and I just, just alone, Dracula fracas, greatest name for a band ever.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
But and again, I just love that there's your immediate cause and effect. Guys on TV says, "Hey, I'll be there. Let's go." And the kids all show up, and the next day it's in the papers. But then I got to talk about Asmodeus, and Terrence and Asmodeus had not been written about at all. There was no history with them, so I was really proud to be able to put that stuff together. We talked to some guys from Chemo who had worked on the Asmodeus show, and got a lot of information. That was great. Got to write about Bob Wilkins and John Stanley, and then also the Ghoul and Son of Svengoolie, because they were syndicated here and did have an effect. So those are the two big books. But I wrote some articles for Scary Monsters magazine on individual hosts, as well as just some more generalized host info. Horror Hound magazine.
Right.
And I'm currently working on a new book that will basically cover the national phenomena the same way that I did the local phenomena for Shock to Me. The working title is TV Spook Show, Broadcast Ghosts and Horror Hosts. And
good title.
So it's really basically talking about the analog era of television and the horror host place and all of that.
Wow, that's definitely something to keep an eye out for. I will definitely read that when it comes out. So is there anywhere our listeners can go to contact you or learn more about you, Michael?
If people are interested, I don't have a website or a Facebook page. I'm just not. To me, a Facebook page is like those Japanese digital animals that die if you don't feed them.
Tamagotchi.
Yeah. Okay. Whatever. Yeah. That's exactly what it's like. Someone gave me one of those once, and it died in its own crap.
Right.
And that's my feeling about Facebook, is like you have to feed it every day, and it becomes a huge responsibility. I'm not interested. But
Right.
that said, if people are interested, and very seriously, I'm always happy to be in contact with people. They can reach me at my email address, which is drghoulfinger@gmail.com. And the spelling on that, it's all lowercase, DOKTORGOULFINGER. One word, lowercase. And if people have questions about their local host or want to share stories about their local host, I'm seriously more than happy to communicate, because that stuff really is my bread and butter. It's a history I really, really love.
Well, and it shows. We can tell just listening to you that you absolutely adore this subject.
Yeah, you can tell because you can't get me to shut up about it.
Well, I wish we could go on for another hour or two, but unfortunately, we try to keep the shows under 2 hours if we can. So
don't blame me a bit.
No. And of course, they can also learn more about the horror house phenomenon if they track down the movie American Scary that's been referenced already.
Absolutely, and the book American Scary, which is even better, can be purchased through Amazon, and the Shock It To Me book, privately produced, so they can contact me directly, or if they're interested in buying a copy of that.
You might consider putting that up on Kindle sometimes, like the whole ebook thing. You could actually publish that yourself for literally no cost online.
That's a really good point. And I think that was going to be. I had a friend who was helping with that, Lon Hubbard, who passed away 2 years ago, and but he was the guy who really pushed me to finish this book and to make it as comprehensive as I finally did. And he also did all the layouts on it. And once we were finished with it, that was our next discussion, was creating either an electronic book or doing further printing through Kindle or something like that. And just never. So that just never happened. I still got a lot of hard copies on me, and I'm more than happy to get those out there, because it really is a good book.
All right, so I think we're going to bring the show to a close then. So, Don, any final thoughts before we go?
Oh no, I think this was you brought a lot of good info, because a lot of what you were talking about ties in with stuff from other shows, and it's interesting that everything all kind of pulls together. And when you look at, say, especially like the horror host, you start realizing that there had to be so many things in place that hit all at the same time that allows something like this to truly flourish.
No, absolutely. You nailed it. It was really a convergence of factors that led to this. Otherwise, it would have just been a little piddling thing happening here and there. But you're absolutely right. And it was that shock package. It was the same thing as Elvis or the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. Those are events that really just changed the course of popular culture.
Yeah, in an amazing way. Okay, so thank you everyone for listening to the show tonight. Thank you, Michael, for coming on. And happy Halloween to everyone listening to this.
Yeah, happy
Good night,
Halloween.
folks.
Enjoy.
Hi, operatives. Rob here. Our interview with Michael Monahan went so well that the three of us actually ended up talking for another hour and a half after the show. Luckily for everyone, the recorder was still running, and so next week I'll be putting the highlights of that after-show chat into the feed. It's some great stuff about the nature of community and media, how horror hosts are literally fading away, and how horror hosts reacted to 9/11. You do not want to miss it. In fact, it's such good stuff, we're offering you the chance to hear it early. We've put up a listener survey on the show's website at obeythedna.com, and everyone who fills it out in the next week will get an early link to download the extra show as thanks for filling it out. But even if you're not interested in getting the early show, or if you're listening to this after Halloween 2016, we'd love it if you dropped by and filled out our listener survey.
The more we know about you, beyond your incredibly good taste in podcast listening, of course, the better we can give you the kind of thing you enjoy. Don and I do this show based on our own tastes, but this show is a community effort, and we want to hear your voices as well. So thanks for listening, and tune in 2 weeks when we'll be exploring the changing nature of nerdliness with guest Jack Ward. Good night, folks. Stay nerdly. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.